The supreme quality of leadership is unquestionable integrity. Without it, no real success is possible, no matter whether it is on a section gang, a football field, in an army, or in an office. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the country's current state of affairs as far as the country's economy is concerned and the talks with the IMF. Now, to discuss all this and more, we've invited a special guest to our studio this evening. You already know him. He is none other than the Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Nandalal Weerasinghe. A very good evening, Dr. Weerasinghe, and thank you very much for joining us this evening on Face the Nation.
Good evening.
Now, when you took over office, Dr. Weerasinghe, you said that we were on a plunge. We are in a situation where we needed brakes to the vehicle that is on a plunge already. Do you see any progress thus far with the efforts that you have taken after taking over office of the central bank in April?
Yeah, of course, if you go back and basically look at the situation when I took the office somewhere in April, even before. So there was obviously a change in government even by then, and then there was a cabinet resigned. There's a new finance minister was appointed. The governor of central bank resigned. Not even that. In terms of economic situation and shortages of fuel, there was, I think I can remember, power cuts about 9-10 hours. Long queues was already there, and there was a shortage of foreign exchange in the banking system. Central bank was struggling to finance essential imports. There was this kind of situation, and also on top of that, there was no clear plan how to recover the economy from that kind of situation that we saw at that point. If you think about where we are now, from that point onwards, obviously we had even more difficult situations later in terms of political instability, social unrest escalated to a different level, and also the long petroleum queues all are there. But now situation has in fact been easing over last about a month, 1.5 months period in terms of availability of fuel, availability of gas, some of the essential items, but that's not the end of this thing. Still there are a lot of limitations. But and also the one other important milestone in that recovery process, as you plan from that point onwards, is that we have been able to reach what we call staff level agreement with the IMF. That is, I think, one key milestone in the recovery process, so in economic stabilization process, that from that point onwards we have been basically going through. So that is one important one. And also in terms of other things, you can see, and there are certain other ones, basically you can see the availability, although there are certain shortages of certain items, but in terms of the people's ordinary life compared to the difficulties people are facing during that period, now all you can see some improvement, but we have some way to go going forward.
Yes. Dr. Nandalal, interestingly, do you agree that the previous or the former government lied to the Sri Lankan people about how bad the financial situation in the country was and the way in which how they managed the country's economy? Because we heard at one point the former governor of the central bank stating that there was $2.9 billion by the end of the year, but that was not the case to be. In January, a haphazard decision was taken by the central bank to pay off the $500 million ISB fund repayment as well. Issues of this sort, do you believe that the previous government lied to the people of the country?
I don't specifically say that previous government lied. In fact, how I see the situation, that once I came back to central bank, and I look back at what has actually happened, what I saw, basically my position is that in fact the then key officials, those who are responsible for the briefing the minister, the president, cabinet, the parliament, in my view, they have not been briefed properly of the actual situation that the central bank was facing in terms of availability of liquid foreign reserves and our ability to make our debt service payments going forward, and our ability to finance essential imports. All the difficulties were already there, but in fact what has happened, basically the true situation that country was facing for a period of time have not been properly briefed, in my view, to the policymakers or the cabinet or to the minister or to the parliament. This is why what I said soon after when I took the office, first thing I did was basically once I realized the situation, I was able to brief then administration about the true situation. That is where the government took certain key decisions and took a different path from that point onwards.
Dr. Nandalal, the question that begs in everyone's mindset or a mind frame at the moment is, who is responsible for this situation? We were a prosperous nation at one point. Look at where we are now. Look at the way in which how people are behaving in terms of the cost of living. It's very, very high. Things are not affordable. You mentioned about fuel, you mentioned about gas, you mentioned about the rising cost of living in the country. If a finger had to be pointed at someone, who can the people point the finger at?
I don't think it's fair for me to, as a governor central bank, to look back and point the finger to any individual, any person. What I say is that there are partly, as I mentioned earlier, there has not been properly updated the authorities, and secondly, there have been some policy mistakes during, say, some period and also historically by successive governments. This is one part of this problem that the country experiences, is that the legacy over several decades of successive governments have been running what we call the large fiscal deficits, and running high fiscal deficits and accumulating huge amount of public debt, both domestic and the external. But still we have the ability to access capital markets, and we are able to borrow and run that model over a period of time. But after that, there were some policy mistakes that, for example, reducing taxes. Obviously, COVID also contributed, and the Easter Sunday attack also had a contribution. Those are the external events. In addition, some of the policy mistakes, and also other part is that once you recognize once you see there are policy mistakes, we could have reversed and made those policies into a correct path. Then we probably would have prevented this kind of a deep economic crisis if we took the steps sometime earlier than what we were trying to do now. So that basically the reason why we are in this situation. To answer your question, I don't think it's right for me to, point out any individual or group of people. It is all policy making. this probably that time administration thought that was a correct policy, but later it was realized that is not the correct policy. In fact, that could have been reversed, but that unfortunately did not happen until crisis erupts. So that was a reason.
But we've seen, Dr. Nandalal, not only this time, but even when it came to the Greek bonds that took place in the country, the notion was it was a policy decision that was taken at that time, and henceforth we can't do anything about it. Now we hear the same things being projected as well. Policy decisions have gone wrong, but isn't it utterly mismanagement by the regime that was appointed subsequent to 2020? Do you think that there would have been in any action or any way to arrest the problems that we were facing as a nation at that time?
Yeah, I think if the government, current government thinks there was some mistakes or there was some missteps or some bad management, all these things. I think it's the responsibility of any government to look into those the situations and conduct an inquiry or appoint a commission, and one can look into those things. I mean, this is up to the parliament, cabinet, or the government to make that decision if they want to look into those areas. I don't think I should make any comment on that kind of thing.
Dr. Nandalal, there are talks about you are going to be replaced in the future and someone is trying to pull your leg. Who is doing so?
I don't think, I don't know anything about that. I think probably, I can't comment on this because I have not been told or I have not been informed. Or I think I have seen a lot of, talks at the parliament, a lot of other things, but it's completely out of, my kind of this thing. And in this, I also hear certain things, but I don't believe that. I don't see any reason why, I should be removed, or if the government wants to find anything fault with me, obviously it's up to the government. I don't think.
Have you been able to act independently thus far since April? Yeah, whatever decisions that you've taken, you've taken in a very professional manner?
In fact, I think if you look at the central bank, the Monetary Law Act that governs the central banking activities in the law, so we have sufficient Monetary Board has sufficient independence to exercise, to make decisions independently, the right decision for the country. So I certainly have been able to make those decisions with the Monetary Board in a very independent manner, and as far as we think, those are the decisions that we have to make, and we have been able to make those decisions without any problem.
But if you look at the COPE committee proceedings that took place recently, pointing the finger at the previous Monetary Board and the governor of the central bank with regard to holding the currency as a ceiling, this has been discussed outright, saying that $5 billion have been spent to hold the currency against the US dollar. Now, you are trying to say, Dr. Nandalal Weerasinghe, that there were no issues pertaining to mismanagement. It's only been directed at policy decisions. Was this also a wrong policy decision that was taken by the previous administration?
Yeah, in fact, in my view, the exchange rate management and exchange rate policy would have been basically, if I was the governor, I would have managed it differently. To say basically, in a situation where we had only limited amount of external resources available, and also when we lost access to international capital markets, that we were not able to replenish our resource through borrowings. In that kind of situation, I think the decision to maintain a fixed exchange rate at 203 rupees per dollar for a long period was not going to be sustainable anyway. So that was a wrong policy that was maintained by the previous central bank administration. As a result, what was happened basically, not only that we lost our external resource by trying to defend the currency at a certain rate, but also as a result of highly undervalued currency, that we suppress value of the rupee at that level, we are seeing the imports have been growing well above the normal rates. For example, last 2 years, with certain with some restrictions on imports, we saw import expenditure of the country on average rose to about $2 billion. That was one of the highest imports that we have seen in the recent past, and at some point it was $2.2 billion on monthly basis. So that was all because we had maintained a suppressed exchange rate for too long period, and we basically use up our external resource to defend that currency. And as a result of ballooning or increasing imports compared to exports, foreign exchange income, then obviously we basically even we didn't have resource to use for even essential imports. That's what happened basically. That's how we ended up in this what we call now balance of payment crisis.
Right. Dr. Nandalal, you speak about very eloquently about the country situation and where we are at the moment, but you do not mention the fact that who was responsible behind what was going on in the country. My question is directed to you based on the recent meetings you had with the IMF. You had a meeting with the IMF. The meeting seems to be very successful. The IMF had agreed to a staff level agreement with the government of Sri Lanka amounting to $2.9 billion US. Is this something to be happy? Because if you look at the numbers, let's look at the numbers, Dr. Nandalal. You have $27 billion US to be paid as debt by the year 2027. Right now, we have decided that we won't pay any debt. So the IMF had said that they would provide us $2.9 billion US, which is just a needle in a haystack. It's a very small amount. If you look at the country's import bill for a month, goes up to approximately 1.4 billion to 1.5 billion. Then you have the numbers standing at $1.1 billion coming from the export revenue as export revenue, and approximately around 300 million to 400 million US coming in as revenue from the migrant workers, and a little bit again from tourism as well. This is nothing. Is this something to celebrate?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, you explained the situation very nicely where we are now. For example, now what you said, the amount of debt service payments, external debt service payments over the next 4 or 5 years, on average, we had to pay about in the near future $6 billion per year over the next 4 years, and another $4-5 billion is about $27 billion over next say 4-5 years. And also the situation is our resource almost non-existent, almost zero, the resource that we have. This is where
there's absolutely nothing, Dr. Nandalal?
No, we have small amounts, but we use that amount to pay for import of petroleum or something, and then once we
How much is that number?
It's basically, when I took over the position, liquid resource was about $20 million that we had, or liquid resource available to finance for imports. But we had this 1.5 billion worth of Chinese soap that basically is not usable. And there are some reserves, those are basically nuclear resource that is not in liquid form. So what was available for us to use about 20 million, and over a period of time we sometimes build up resource for $100 million, $200 million, but we don't keep that resource. We use that whatever we purchase and use that money to pay for import of essential items. That's how it goes up and coming down. The point that I am making here, when you have this relatively very low level of resource, when you have to pay $27 billion over next say 4-5 years, then obviously this is where the government had to announce that we are not in, although government is willing to meet our external debt service payments, but our ability is also almost zero. That's where the government announced, okay, this is debt standstill, means we are not in a position to pay. Give us some time for us to, first thing is to restructure our debt obligations, and on that basis we basically are now seeking a kind of a relief from our external creditors. Now we can't pay $27 billion in next say 5-6 years. We will say, okay, this is a very small amount that we can pay, and we will pay this over a period of time after that, after restructuring. That is the request that we are making from external creditors. So that is one thing. And also you mentioned the import bill, and this is where, as I said earlier, last year our import bill was $2 billion, export was around $1 billion. There's a trade deficit itself at $1 billion gap in over and above debt service payments. So the next challenge was how we can bring this gap and maintain at least the amount of foreign exchange we are getting, and we have to contract our imports to the extent that we can finance all these imports only out of our foreign exchange earnings. For example, exports is about now $1.2 billion, as we mentioned, remittances about $3 billion, $1.5 billion. Then import bill about now has come down from $2 billion to $1.3 billion. So if you look at the numbers, now we should be able to at least manage the situation on a gradual basis without borrowing new money for us to manage until we reach the agreement with the IMF. They start disbursing what they call 2.9 billion.
Right.
That the point other one is that 2.9 billion obviously not sufficient. 2.9 billion will come on over a period of time. What we expect is that with that IMF agreement, also then there will be World Bank and IMF, World Bank and Asian Development Bank and other multilateral agencies will enhance their help to Sri Lanka on that basis, and they will give some more money. That is another part. So another about 4-5 billion we can get from other sources. And also in addition, if we get relief from that, our external creditors that we can pay it later, then we don't have to have that amount of resource. That's why going forward, I am confident that we should be able to manage the situation with the IMF money, with money we are expecting from ADB and World Bank, and also the adjustment in the current account and trade account.
Right. So I want to open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate right is Nadim Majid, on to my immediate left is Jayamal Ratnayake. But before that, just one final question to you in the first round. Dr. Nandalal will of course speak about the IMF meetings and what was discussed in length at the IMF meetings when the journalists begin to pose questions to you. But little does people know that there were also two other groups in Colombo last week. That was members or representatives from LASADS and also the World Bank. So there were 3 high-level teams in Sri Lanka during the last 1 week. That is LASADS, World Bank and the IMF. We all know what the outcome of the IMF meeting was, but what was the outcomes of the meetings with the World Bank and the LASADS group?
In fact, the World Bank role at this point is there are 2 parts. One is the World Bank, because when we announced the debt standstill, means that we are not going to meet the service obligations of the bilateral and commercial creditors, but still multilateral agencies like World Bank, ADB, we will continue to repay their debt with interest. So with that, the World Bank can, for the short-term financing, because we need some money for bridging financing, for that, World Bank role is to reallocate, what they call repurpose, some of the money allocated for some of the projects that, for example, road development projects, some health sector, some other projects. Because of the emergency situation, they have stopped all these projects and reallocate money that was those available for those projects for emergency, for example, on gas supply, some pharmaceuticals. So World Bank and also social safety nets that we talk about, the help cash transfers to poor and vulnerable people. That money is coming from the World Bank. That is the role of World Bank until we go to the IMF. And the LASAD and the Clifford Chance, those are the financial advisors and legal advisors who will help us to restructure our external debt. For that purpose, in fact, they have to work with authorities with us, and also they have to work with the IMF also. There is a role for the IMF, for their role is to set the debt targets for Sri Lanka to achieve over next 10-year periods. Why that has to happen? Because based on the IMF analysis, our debt is not sustainable, public debt is not sustainable.
Right.
So the IMF to be able to lend to any member country, we have to make our debts, bring that debt into a sustainable level. So for that purpose, we have hired the LASAD and the Clifford Chance as our advisors. Yeah,
very quickly, Dr. Nandalal, before I give an opportunity for Jayamal and Nadim to pose questions to you. We've seen lies being made after lies in Parliament right throughout. People are complex with regard to what is going on in the country. Recently, we heard a strongman in the present government stating that the dollar against the Sri Lankan rupee will slide down to 300 rupee levels. Now, this raises an eyebrow to the exporters who are now forward booking because the country's situation is not that great. What is your message to the exporters who are now thinking the dollar is at 355, the dollar was very volatile at one point, now we are talking about the dollar coming down to 300 rupees. Is this even possible? Because we know that when the IMF comes to a country, they don't want the country or the central bank to put a cap or a ceiling on the US dollar against the rupee. And you also mentioned that we've already spent around 5 billion US dollars trying to protect this. So do you think that this figure will come down to somewhere like 300 rupees? And if that happens, the exporters are going to go bankrupt in the country.
On the exchange rate, let me just explain why we are the policy on the exchange rate is basically, as you correctly mentioned, there was huge volatility once the central bank floated the currency, and then we brought in some stability by providing guidance to the market. So remember, this dollar was 200 rupees a dollar, say during the month of March. So all of a sudden the 200 went up to 365, even 380, and then we stabilized at around 365. If you look at the depreciation of rupee against the dollar during this very short period, if you look at the analysis, it says is now rupee has heavily undervalued, which means the value of the rupee, basically value of the dollar, have overshot to a level which is much more than the fundamental value of rupee. So this happened because we didn't have any resource. We let the currency float. Then there's a overshooting situation. That's what happened. But if you look at the exchange rate policy that we basically going to implement, we have been implementing in the past, is the particular flexible exchange rate regime under the monetary policy framework we call inflation targeting regime. So that's why if you look at the IMF, what they have recommended, allow a greater flexibility in the exchange rate going forward, and the target that we are going to agree with the IMF, so we have agreed with the IMF, is to build our external resource from current very low levels to a certain level for a period of time. Gradually we have to build up our resource from for now 0 to $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, at least to bring back it to around $7-8 billion, the level that we had earlier. So that is the target we have to achieve. But achieving that target, then other condition or the thing we have to do is to allow currency to be lot more flexible. Allow that to be determined in the market rates based on the market
so it
forces,
won't come down.
Demand and supply.
Yeah, so, but Dr. Nanda, it won't come down to 300 level.
No one can say, it's not right for the government central bank to say where it will be, and it's not appropriate. That's why I don't want to comment on where it will be, but I can tell you the principle behind it, that is a demand and supply. For example, if the supply of dollars, for example, if we improve exports, or if there's a large inflow of foreign currency coming from IMF or World Bank or somewhere else, then we can see a greater supply in the market.
Right.
That can appreciate the currency. But then we have the choice from the central bank, do we need to allow that currency to appreciate sharply? What we are trying to manage is to, while allowing kind of flexibility in determining exchange rate of demand and supply, but also we will be minimizing in our interventions to minimize the volatility. So no one would like, rupee value today 365, tomorrow 380, next day 350, and again 340, again going up to 360. That is a huge volatility. So our policy that will be going forward, once we see more foreign exchange coming into the market, then we will manage the situation on a gradual basis and allow market to determine the exchange rate. So if the situation is going to be continuous, there will be more inflows coming in, then there will be pressure for the currency to appreciate. But we won't allow currency to appreciate from today 365 to 350 next day. Now that won't be, that we will allow it to move gradually in which, whatever the direction on a gradual basis, while we are intervening in the market to either build up our resource or use our resource to intervene. But if we don't have resource, we can't intervene. So then we have to allow the currency to
So what you're
determine in the
saying
market.
is what Minister Ali Sabri was saying in Parliament to bring down the currency at 300 rupees against the US dollar will not happen immediately.
It can't happen immediately because for that to happen, we need to have a large inflow of foreign exchange come into the country within a short period.
And it won't happen right now.
It can happen if we get continuously, if we're getting inflows. That can happen. I think I don't know.
I have a lot of follow-up questions on this, but I want to open the floor. Yes, nothing.
I want to talk about this IMF staff level agreement. There's growing calls now from many members of the opposition in Parliament as well that the contents of the agreement itself should be made public. What is your position on this?
If you look at the IMF, we had 16 IMF programs in the past, and all the time, based on my knowledge on the IMF programs in the past, usually when the government or Minister of Finance and Central Bank reaches staff level agreement with the IMF, at that point, what happens usually, I mean, we had not done that yet, Minister of Finance and the Governor of Central Bank signs this document called Memorandum of Understanding on Economic Policies. That is a kind of agreement on the basis of the conditions and all these policies that we are going to implement in next 2-3 years. At that stage, we have government, successive government in the past has never basically tabled this document in the Parliament, or even to my knowledge, it had not even been submitted to the cabinet at that
my question
point
is,
of
should it
signing.
Should it be? Should it be made?
That's basically for the purpose of transparency of policies. I think it would be good to share as much as possible with the public, with the Parliament, anyone. But what we have to understand is that there are certain kind of policies and measures, those are very market sensitive. Those cannot be basically informed to the public in advance. So, for example, let me give some example. Say, for example, if the government is going to increase VAT rate, so I don't think government will announce it in advance. Even government is going to increase, say, taxes on cigarettes or something. It cannot be announced in advance. It can be submitted to the Parliament at the time of the announcement. That's why you see in the budget certain proposals, those are informed. So information is submitted to the Parliament at the time of the implementation, not in advance, because certain things cannot be basically revealed in advance.
And
that is the complication.
Yeah, and I think with Sri Lanka in the past, we've seen how persons who have been allegedly able to access this information before it was made public have used it to their benefit.
Exactly. This is an issue. Certain policies, I mean, broadly, if you look at the IMF, this press release, this has certain level of information. So there are 7 areas that government will agree to implement in next 3-4 years. Those are there. But in detailed proposals, it says, okay, support fiscal consolidation. We are from one of the lowest revenue levels in the world. We have a program to implement major tax reforms. But lot of tax reforms cannot be announced or cannot be informed to the Parliament in advance until that is basically implemented. Things like income tax increases. So basically,
but they have made indications, at least there has been talk about, for example, a wealth tax.
Yeah, they have obviously, I heard in the media conference they mentioned about it. Certain information they revealed. They said there will be the wealth tax they are recommending, there will be high income taxes, there will be some more direct tax, indirect taxes, and the increase the tax base, like get more people into the taxness, administrative measures to enhance tax. All these things were basically, those are the key kind of policies, but there is a limit to what can be basically shared with public or with the Parliament. All certainly should be shared with the Parliament because this is a authority in the public finance.
Yeah.
So at the time of the implementation, that has to be submitted to pass legislation and then implement.
Governor,
At some
the next
stage.
step in the IMF sort of the program that we're entering into now is we need to obtain executive board level approval from the IMF. When do you see that happening? Because we saw that even with the staff level agreement, there were delays. Do you feel that with the executive board level approval or authorization, that will also take some time, or do you see it happening?
Yeah, here the complication what we have in under normal circumstances, if we didn't have this debt issue, even last 16 times, I guess, all the time, once we reach the staff level agreement, within next 6 weeks, then it will be circulated with the members of the executive board of the IMF, and this it will be approved by the executive board within about 6 weeks. Then it will IMF will start dispersing funds on a tranche basis. That's a normal process. But this time it's a social location. This time is a because our debt is not sustainable. IMF, even though we agreed on our macro fiscal program, but IMF cannot start dispersing the commitments until we bring our debt into a sustainable level. For that, we have to restructure our debt and negotiate with our creditors. Then, in that process, next step is to obtain financial assurances from bilateral creditors. So that is the next important step.
The debt restructuring negotiation.
Debt restructuring negotiation, we already commenced the process, and then at some point our creditors will say, okay, we will agree to give you certain amount of relief, especially by bilateral creditors, India, China and Japan. So once they give that assurance, then only the IMF can submit this proposal to the executive board, and then they can start dispersing. In the timeline, as the question you asked, timeline, what we think, and even the IMF is of the view, they think about it might take until, say, IMF board to approve somewhere in December. That is the timeline.
As soon as December?
Yeah. I mean,
is that optimistic?
No, I think this is the normal scenario. But when I see the indication statements made by our bilateral creditors, both India, Japan and China, in the last couple of days, I think I am a bit more optimistic that they are forthcoming and they are now expressed their willingness to support Sri Lanka in that restructuring process.
No, but China, Dr. Nandalal initially said that they were not in favor of the Sri Lankan government going to the IMF and looking at debt restructuring as a solution for the current crisis in the country. However, recently, a few days ago, the Chinese ambassador made a different remark altogether. That's a different story. But do you think the staff level agreement will be reached and we'll get our first tranche by the end of December? That's a little bit wishful thinking, isn't it?
No, I think I'm quite confident that if December is even, I personally think we can do it even before. This IMF and the our advisors think they might need somewhere until December, because they think there are some uncertainties. Still, this is not very clear, as you mentioned, whether China or Japan or India, where their position is not yet very clear.
Dr. Nandalal,
but what I say, even the statement that they made, you are right. They at the beginning, China was still concerned about the debt restructuring, that they have been delaying with some other countries like Zambia. It took about 12 months for them to come to an agreement. On that basis, that's why concern. If China took that long to get to enter into an agreement like they did for countries like Zambia, then it might delay.
Governor, if that's the case, let's operating on the premise that there will be some resistance to the traditional form of, let's call it the traditional form of debt restructuring, of either reducing the loan value or postponing, taking haircuts basically. What are the options that we can offer? Will we be seeing, for example, more in the form of debt for equity swaps?
No, basically in debt restructuring, there are certain options. Traditionally, what we have seen, and based on financial advisors, what they told us is that for the bilateral creditors, it's basically their treatment of their debt is to extend their maturities. For example, if that is a 10-year, long the maturity, it can be extended up to say 20 years or 30 years with a grace period. This is traditional option for bilateral creditors, and also bilateral creditors, as we were told, may not like they say haircuts. They can extend the maturities, they can adjust the interest rates, whereas the commercial creditors, they obviously have different kind of treatments based on the historical experience. Commercial creditors have taken haircuts and some maturity extensions, whereas the bilateral creditors have only given maturity extensions for longer period with low interest rates without any haircut. This is what we have seen.
No, but Dr.
other
Nandalal,
countries.
but the biggest question mark right now is the IMF has given out their plan, they've laid down conditions and so on and so forth. We've had panelists on Face the Nation who came out and said that we as a country need to go to the IMF with a plan. If we don't go with a plan, the IMF is going to give us a plan that is best suited for them and not suited for Sri Lanka. I would like to know what the plan that was proposed by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka in terms of debt restructuring as well, because you mentioned, Dr. Nandalal, that Lasas was just here 1 week ago. And this was the same time that the IMF representatives were also in Colombo. So how can you get the best deal out of the IMF when we were not that prepared?
No, that I think this is not entirely correct what you said by someone else. Here there are two roles. One is the IMF, other one is external creditors through our advisors. So the role of the IMF is to agree with the authorities, with us, Central Bank and Ministry of Finance and the other authorities, about our macroeconomic policy program and structural reforms program for next, say, 4 years. That's a 4-year program. That's a part the IMF that we have to agree with the IMF. And second part in the IMF program is they set they call debt targets. For example, if our debt to GDP this year is, say, for example, 120% of GDP, which is unsustainable in the analysis, then we have to bring it down to, say, 90% over 10-year period. That's what we call debt target. So what IMF sets out is basically the debt targets for our debt to be sustainable over a period of time. That's the only thing that IMF will set out in their plan. Then after that, it's up to the sovereign or authority to discuss with our creditors, go to them and say, okay, now we have a macro program that IMF has endorsed. This is our next 4-year macroeconomic policy program. And also in this program, there are debt targets they have set for us to make our debt sustainable over a long period of time. These are the debt targets we have to achieve. Then we tell them, okay, we have a credible program and this is where the debt targets, please help us for us to reach this debt targets by reducing our debt liabilities over a period of time and give us some more extension, so that this is where the role of the financial advisors and the creditors is another parallel different process.
So how much are we expecting approximately as the first tranche by the end of December or beginning December, to the question that was posed by Nadeem?
2.9 billion or 3 billion over 4-year period means is roughly about $750 million per annum for a 4-year period.
How is the government going to utilize these funds?
No, that is available for the government. Or this time, important one is because we are facing a balance of payment crisis. All the earlier programs, IMF money was available only to the central bank for balance of payment purposes. Those funds are not available for the government to finance the budget deficit. But this time, because of this special situation, money that IMF is giving us, and that money can be used by the government to finance fiscal deficit as well. So that is an additional support IMF giving directly to budget finance, by which then government can bring down the domestic borrowing requirement. For example, now 100% the deficit is financed through domestic borrowings, whereas now once we get this IMF money, to that amount government can reduce the domestic borrowing requirement, and then government can take less debt from the domestic market, so that more money would be available for the private sector developments. So that is the advantage.
Staying on the same topic of debt restructuring, we saw that there is progress being made in terms of discussing with our external creditors, bilateral lenders, and so on when it comes to restructuring international debt. But however, there seems to be some sort of ambiguity when it comes to domestic debt. And many rating agencies have said trying to restructure domestic debt could have an adverse impact on the banking sector of our country, and maybe also on the economy as a whole. Can you give your opinion? Because there have been certain indicators or indications that domestic debt could be restructured, but then again there hasn't been a solid stance on domestic debt restructuring. Can you apprise us of how that will go about?
In fact, when we announced debt standstill, we clearly announced that our intention was to restructure only external debt, because this is a balance of payment crisis. So that was the position government took in April. But going forward, now because we have started the after IMF agreement, staff level agreement with the IMF,
yes,
because we formally started the debt restructuring process, in fact we can't talk about it. That's what we call, technical term is called radio silence.
Okay.
Which means, as authorities, we should not talk about the debt restructuring parameters, whether that would be restructured or not. It's basically because there's a very market sensitive thing. So as a result, it's unfortunately I can't comment on that process from the day that we reached the staff agreement, because we formally started debt restructuring process with our advisors and approaching the creditors at this point.
So Dr. Weerasinghe, talking about the liquidity in the interbanking sector, there is currently a liquidity shortfall of about 700 billion rupees in the interbanking sector, and foreign banks seem to be less interactive in the interbank sector. We know that there were several policy measures made by the central bank in terms of increasing the SRR, the standard deposit facility, the lending facility, and so on. So how would you, as the governor of the central bank, go about making sure that the liquidity in the interbanking sector and the treasury bill market increases over time, and the foreign banks that are currently inactive are given some sort of impetus to re-engage with these markets?
Yeah, that's I think an important point that you made. Let me clarify this little more. Here what we are talking about, the rupee liquidity in the interbank system, and right now overall liquidity deficit in the interbank market is about 500 billion. It was about 700 billion some time ago, but it has come down to about 500 billion.
Right.
So there are several reasons why we had this large liquidity deficit in the domestic market. Is one reason, main one is this: government had been borrowing heavily from the two state banks to finance the deficit. A huge, large overdraft. As a result, they have been using the liquidity in the two state banks and then deploying that deposit funds to pay domestic debt, pay overall debt, all these things. Two banks are highly illiquid. That's the one reason. Other one, when we maintain a tight monetary policy situation, is obviously when a tight monetary policy situation means there's a liquidity deficit in the market.
Right.
So to address that, then other complication, as you characterize it, this liquidity 500 million deficit on net basis in the banking system.
Yes.
But there are foreign banks, those who have excess liquidity. They have about 100 billion, they have liquidity surpluses in rupees, whereas the two state banks is about 700 billion liquidity deficit. So as a result, net is banking system is of negative 500 billion. 500 billion. So there are two things we can do. One is that when we basically relax monetary policy on a gradual basis, then we can pump more liquidity into the system by the central bank, then we can bring down this deficit, and also the government operation can also, if we receive more foreign exchange into the system, which means central bank buys that foreign exchange and pump liquidity in the system, that can also ease liquidity. Another reason why this liquidity situation is affecting to domestic banks is because of the rating downgrade. Foreign banks are not basically, they are not lending to domestic banks because of their internal limits.
Yes.
As a result, they keep their additional whatever 200 billion surplus liquidity, they park it as central bank.
Is that because of the risk involved?
Yeah.
Or? Yes,
Because they have their internal limits. If the risk, the counterparty is to below certain level, then that will trigger for foreign banks for their lending in the interbank market to domestic counterparts. So now, because our ratings are down, they cannot lend. They don't lend to Bank of Sri Lanka, People's Bank, or a lot of other commercial banks because their old ratings are down. So what they do, their surplus they deposit with the central bank, and then we lend to the central bank window to those two state banks to fill their day-to-day liquidity deficit. That's how we manage it on daily basis. But over a period of time, once we get foreign exchange, then we can pump in more liquidity in the system so that we can address the situation. And the monetary policy is
just following up on domestic debt, Dr. Nandalal. Right now, we saw an interim budget being proposed by the incumbent President Ranil Wickremesinghe in Parliament, which was approved overwhelmingly last Friday. However, the budget deficit stands over 2,000 billion Sri Lankan rupees, that is almost touching the 2 trillion mark. How is the government intending to find the funds for this? Because we know for a fact that international loans cannot be obtained. So does that mean more money will be printed again in Sri Lanka, and as a result of that, cost of living is going to go up significantly?
Yeah. Now, if you look at the budget deficit, obviously this is relatively high even this year. Last 2 years, so there was a large fiscal deficit. That's why central bank printed a lot of money and financed that deficit. And this time, still there's about large fiscal deficit, but because there's a kind of relief because government is no longer servicing large part of external debt. So that there's a relief from that part. And other part, because government now has introduced several new taxes, and what the government would expect is that during the balance period of this year, there will be higher tax revenues than what they were getting in the first part of this year because there are no new tax measures introduced on the first part. That will basically add little more revenue compared to first half of this year. And obviously the any balance, because government cannot borrow from international markets, so from external sources until you go to the IMF, then obviously if there's any balance, if there's essential expenditure, for example for salaries, wages, pensions, interest payments, then obviously central bank will have to step in and provide only limited amount of that money to finance the fiscal deficits until we go to the IMF. But important one is that once we come to an agreement with the IMF, once program is approved by the IMF, one of the conditions that we have agreed from that point onwards, central bank is prohibited providing monetary financing to finance the budget deficit. That is completely only up to the program until government gets some external financing. Only up to that point, central bank can print and provide that financing only to the limited amount. That would certainly be lower than the first half because there will be higher revenues in the second half as a result of new tax measures. That is why government had to bring in all the tax measures, because otherwise the printing money in simple terms would have to continue.
But Governor, after you took over office also, you all have printed a lot of money.
Yeah, of course. The difference between what once I took, when I took the office in April to now, the amount of money we printed and compared to what was printed earlier, obviously, earlier central bank printed money even to pay external debt. Now we have stopped that. Now what we are printing money only for essential unavoidable circumstances like government cannot default domestic debt. Government cannot default paying salaries and wages and pensions to people in the public sector. Only for that instances, if government wouldn't have sufficient revenue in their cash flow, only the small difference that we provide from the central bank. Other than that, we have basically reduced to a large extent now
So, Dr. Weerasinghe, during the staff level agreement that was reached, one of the key elements of that program was raising social spending and improving social safety net programs to protect vulnerable groups. So, once this happens, how can the government, even during the interim budget, we saw the president announcing many relief measures for vulnerable groups of society. Once this happens, how can the government finance this? Do we have to print money? Where can we source the funds to basically expand the social safety net, Governor?
Yes, that's a good question again. So for that purpose, this is where we both the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, the two institutions, have repurposed some of the funds available for some other projects for this purpose. For example, now they're talking about almost like for this purpose, $300 million from World Bank and the ADB, especially targeting the
vulnerable
social
groups.
safety net to help poor and vulnerable for this purpose. Yes.
Right.
So, Dr. Nandalal, I just want to drag your attention to January again, just going back to memory lane as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. It was a very significant time, and many of the chamber presidents, chairmen who came on the very show said that we should not pay the $500 million ISP engagement at that time. However, the then governor was very adamant that Sri Lanka had the ability, we had the strength to pay that $500 million. Do you in any way think, Dr. Nandalal, that someone got benefited out of this $500 million ISP payment in January?
Certainly, I can't comment on that. I don't know whether someone has benefited or not.
Right.
But all I can say, we, in fact, to pay that $500 million, in fact, it was basically from India. We have this what we call Asian Clearing Union, the collection of liabilities that accumulate over a 2 months period. So last moment, before 18th of January, before this was settled, luckily Reserve Bank of India agreed to give a deferment to settle these obligations on somewhere around 18th of January, $500 million. Because of that, $500 million are available for the central bank to settle this ISB settlement on 18th of January. If that did not happen, we obviously would have defaulted even that point, hard default. So luckily at that point, Reserve Bank of India agreed to give another 2 months extension. Basically, that $500 million was settled out of 2 month credits that was available for the central bank. There's a very short term credit. The long term liability was settled at that point. And at that point, without that, even from that point onwards, our reserve levels were depleting to very low levels.
Dr.
Still, that administration determined to settle all the obligations irrespective of low levels of reserves.
Dr. Nandalal, I just want to get a follow-up question through. Dr. Nandalal, now we know that during the last few months, the people in Sri Lanka have been agitating on the streets, stating that the stolen money of Sri Lankans should be brought back. There is a World Bank program called the World Bank Star Program, where the Star Program, you must be knowing, Dr. Nandalal, the Star Program is all about to get international support to end the safe haven for corrupt funds, and that's what it does. So why isn't an effort being made to recover stolen assets under the World Bank's Star Program?
I have also heard about this, but I don't know personally about it. I can remember this was talked about even somewhere back in, I think, 2015-16. Then government approached the World Bank and tried to use this instrument with the World Bank. But I'm not quite sure whether that worked or not. And I don't know about this program. I also heard about that. I have seen that was discussed even for a longer period. That has been, I've seen people discussing that, but I don't know how effective that is.
Governor, I want to ask you now, one of the biggest reasons that we got into this, if you look at how our debt is, the different types of debt today. Now, for example, in China, it was a lot of project-based loans. But then you had the international sovereign bonds, the ISBs, which make up a massive portion of our, or significant portion of our debt obligation now.
Commercial debt.
If, let's say, the IMF executive board approval comes through, as far as, how soon before Sri Lanka starts going to international markets again to raise money through ISBs, and would you advocate for that kind of policy, or are you strongly opposed to it?
I certainly, I mean, it is very difficult to predict when Sri Lanka would be able to go back to international capital markets to raise commercial debt at this point. You know, there are a lot of things will have to happen before that. Agree on the debt restructuring and then look at what are the terms in that. All depends on that. So it's difficult to even comment on that and what timing. But in my view, my recommendation is that, so we have seen that based on our experience that we have raised a lot of commercial debt in the past, and even going forward, if the Sri Lankan government is to raise commercial debt going forward, if we can, I don't say raising commercial debt or borrowing is a bad idea. You know, any country to grow, and the country should be able to borrow from wherever. You know, it's a middle income country, it's a commercial sources, capital markets, we have to borrow. The question is that when you borrow the foreign exchange borrowings, we should invest those borrowings in an areas where we can earn foreign exchange. That is the key principle that we have to adopt going forward. If we do that, then obviously I can still recommend that if we are to grow, we have to borrow. The question is that when we borrow, if we use that money for daily consumption, all the purposes, that will not generate sufficient foreign exchange to repay that debt, then we will go back to the debt trap or whatever the debt situation that we experience now. To ensure, if we are to borrow from externally, we should be able to invest properly, and that project should be able to generate foreign exchange so that we can repay that debt over a period of time. That is a simple principle.
So we are getting a lot of questions on the number 0766565353. I'm trying my best to take in as many questions as possible, Dr. Nandalal. So we have another related question to what Jamal asked before with regard to domestic debt. Treasury bill rates have gone up exorbitantly over the last few weeks. How is the Treasury able to back these high rates of interest? Will the Treasury bill investor require to take a haircut when settling these bills in the future?
This is what I said. I can't comment on the debt restructuring process. That's a radio silence. But I can tell you how the government can bear this interest bill. And if you look at even last 2 years, when government interest rate was suppressed at 4%, 5%, still the interest payment, interest bill as a percent of government revenue in last 2 years was over 70%. In last 2 years, before that it was 30-40%, went up to 70%. That was with very low suppressed interest rates. But this year, revenue may be a little higher. But this year, what is important here is to safeguard any business. If you have to pay high interest is still high, what do? You reduce your level of borrowings. This is exactly government will have to do.
No, but right now, Dr. Nandalal, to be fair by the people of Sri Lanka, I know a lot of people, mostly in Colombo and the urban areas, going and investing their hard-earned money in treasury bills. They take loans, they try to invest their hard-earned money, maybe 1 million Sri Lankan rupees or maybe 500,000 Sri Lankan rupees, because the interest looks very attractive on treasury bills.
No, that's good.
Now, you as the governor of the central bank, when you are saying that you have to maintain silence with regard to whether or not a haircut will be taken by the central bank on treasury bills, that sends a very negative or amber signal to the investor. They might even pull out their money if that's the case.
No, I mean, I made comments before this structural agreement was reached. I clearly announced the debt standstill position at that point. And now the complication is that because we are in the process of debt restructuring, it is not appropriate. It is a market sensitive information. I should not comment as a person who is involved in that process. That is the reason. It's a technical reason, nothing else.
Dr. Weerasinghe, what is the current rate of inflation in the country at present?
I think end of a couple of days ago, 65% CPI,
Okay.
CPI, yes.
This is, I asked you for my knowledge to structure my follow-up question, because in basic economics we know that inflation is caused by either demand pull or cost
Supply.
pull reasons, right? So we could attribute inflation in the past for to demand pull causes, because taxes were slashed and whatnot, and then consumption increased. And later on, when taxes are increased and subsidies are slashed, will this lead to a cost push sort of inflation? How optimistic are you on controlling inflation in the country, Governor?
Yeah, that's why if you look at the current inflation, in fact, we saw this, as you quite rightly mentioned, inflation has two parts. One is the supply side, supply and one-off increases because of some certain price.
Yeah.
Other one is the excess demand that was created through printing a lot of money, large monetary expansion, low interest rates. So that impact would be felt over a period of time. That's why the high inflation we see now, a certain part of that high inflation is because of that earlier monetary expansion, earlier higher demand. Now, to address that, we increase our interest rates significantly in April. Now, that part is now gradually being addressed. But what we see now, because we floated the currency in March, and currency depreciated almost from 200 to 360.
Cost of imports increased.
And cost of imports increased, imported inflation, and on top of that, global commodity prices also went up. And then all of a sudden, the domestic prices of petroleum, gas, all the things had to be adjusted upwards within a very short period. So there are cost push side, the energy prices, currency depreciation, and one-off increases in certain prices, reflect to prices. That's all kind of a supply side issue.
Right.
So that's why, technically, if we address inflation going forward, interest rates will have to be higher than inflation, at least on average, in the demand-driven side.
Yes.
This is where, even though inflation is 60%, still, as you mentioned earlier, somebody mentioned, interest rates, even yield rates are only 30%. It's half of that, which means half of the inflation probably we can see as a demand-driven, half we can see as a supply and cost push inflation.
So it's a mix of both.
Mix of both.
So I'm getting a lot of questions. Let me take this question as well, Nadim, if I may. When Basil Rajapaksa was the Minister of Finance, Ranil Wickremesinghe, attending an all-party government meeting, requested or asked for the sight of the agreement with the IMF at that time. Now Ranil Wickremesinghe is the Minister of Finance. Why can't he be transparent with the IMF agreement?
You have to ask that from the president, not from me.
I'm getting a lot of questions. I need to take some of the questions, Dr.
No, I mean, let me give my view of that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good to have a transparency in terms of what the government is going to do in terms of IMF. But as I mentioned, there are certain things that basically there are market sensitive things cannot be revealed until that is implemented. That is the only thing
Who
that
signed this staff level agreement?
It's basically the
with
document once
the
it's
IMF.
finalized, the Minister of Finance and the Government Central Bank signs the document.
So you are fully aware of the contents of this agreement in question. Is it there's a famous saying, Dr. Nandalal, there is never a free lunch. There's always something that everyone is going to ask from you. So there's never a free lunch. Is this something that Sri Lanka can reap the benefits out of this staff level agreement, or is it something that is going to go negative as far as Sri Lanka is concerned?
No, certainly I think this is the whole idea of reaching this staff level agreement with all important macro, fiscal and structural reforms agenda is to reap benefits out of those reforms and the macroeconomic programs. Without that, why should we go through very painful process, come out of this crisis if there's any other way? This is the only way that we can come out of this crisis. Obviously, there's a painful process, but we have to go through this process.
So when you say a painful process, Dr. Nandalal, now a loaf of bread is going at 300 rupees at the moment. Will we at least see a reduction of bread prices in the country? Let's talk about the normal, the grassroots level individual who's living in the country. Will this price come down?
No, this is an important question. You see, when the price levels go up, certainly it can come down on a gradual basis to a certain extent, but the inflation is the rate of change of that prices. So what we are going to see is the inflation will certainly come down. We will bring it down. That does not mean prices will come down. So for example, now what you say, it's a loaf of bread. If say it's not 300, I think today 200. I wouldn't say 200 will become 100.
It's 300 rupees today.
No, I think I saw news today. The minister said they also talk, but they still price is anyway. Let's say 300 for the sake of argument. If today price is 300, I wouldn't expect that to come down to 150 or somewhere there, unless we see huge reduction in global wheat prices after the end of the Russia-Ukraine war. That's one of the reasons why wheat prices went so high. If something like that from external event happens, otherwise this price won't come down. So here the answer to these high prices is people's income should also be increased for them to be able to afford these prices. That is the only way to address inflation. Once inflation is there,
let's leave aside Dr. Nandalal bread for a moment. Let's think about rice for an example. The main intention of a government who is in power is to make sure that the people are able to eat, people are able to survive. Now, a kilogram of rice was hovering at around 200 rupees or 220 rupees when the price of urea was at 7,000 rupees. Today, the price of urea is going at approximately 18,000, 20,000 rupees. Can you expect the prices of rice to at least come down in the future?
No, it can't. This is why I'm saying same argument. The price of rice is a basically factor of the cost of production. So one is the fertilizer, other one is basically the price of paddy. The price of paddy cannot be lower as long as cost of production is higher. Say all wages has gone up, fertilizer prices have gone up, diesel prices have gone up. So the farmer with current prices of input prices I don't think cannot produce. That's why government has set the paddy purchase price 120 rupees a kilo. I think that's probably low price. And if the government or paddy miller buys paddy at 120 rupees a kilo, then kilo of rice should be, I think, 180 to 200 rupees. So there's two sides of that. Farmer should get a reasonable price for his production, and also the consumer should get a reasonable price, depending on what is the cost of production. I mean as I said, solution is that people's income should be higher so that they should be able to afford the higher prices with inflation. That is the bad part of the inflation. That is why people call inflation is the worst enemy in any economic crisis. That is why central bank is focusing.
Have you reached the hyperinflation level?
Not yet. And usually it says if inflation goes above 100%, if it is running out of control, then we call it hyperinflation. This is what we want to prevent at any cost. This is why
it will be like Venezuela, will be like Lebanon after that.
I mean, this Zimbabwe is a best example. They had to cut their value of the notes by several zeros to be cut, and they dollarized the economy. If that happens, the country cannot survive, and no one can do any business. This is why it's important that people complain high interest rates, saying that they can't do business, interests are too high, we can't pay their loans, we can't meet their debt service obligation, interests are too high. But if inflation is going to hyperinflation, no one can survive in this. First, people who would be impacted are poor, low-income people with high inflation. Even if you now look at now, if the last year when inflation is 60% means someone who earned 100 rupees last year, the value of that, real value of that is now 40 rupees, which means they had to live out of, earlier they lived out of 100 rupees, they live out of 40 rupees, they have to cut a lot of expenses.
Governor, on the subject of inflation, you would have seen, I'm sure, there's an economist from the United States who became, who's from the Cato Institute, who became very popular in the Twitter sphere when the economic crisis was getting dire, and he was doing inflation calculations for Sri Lanka. And he constantly pushed this recommendation along with his calculations that Sri Lanka should abolish the central bank and substitute it with the currency board instead. Where do you stand on this?
No, it's two things. One is his measure of inflation. I think there's a different theoretical model that basically derives inflation out of this model based on the monetary policy, the reserve money exchange, all these things. That's a different method. But the internationally accepted way of measuring inflation, consumer price inflation, is what we call the standard way that we are doing. You collect prices of basket of goods and services, then they look at this and index it and look at the change. That is inflation. That's simple, all over the world accepted. That's a real inflation, proper inflation. But there is a proxy that he has his own model. It tells us, our inflation is not 60%, it's 120%, something like that. That's based on his method. But I don't think that is the right way to measure inflation for monetary policy purposes. That's the one thing on inflation. Second one, on the currency board argument, that's again, for a currency board to sustain, there are a lot of other things will have to happen. For example, now we are seeing a lot of other countries trying to implement currency boards that collapse one after the other, because you need to have a strong macro fiscal discipline. You need to maintain a certain level of fiscal deficit over a long period of time, and with that you have macroeconomic imbalances. Only when currency board can sustain. But in our situation, the government is running large fiscal deficits, and this currency board, and also we need to have a sufficient number. It's like, if you look at when exchange rate was fixed at 203 rupees for 2 years, so currency board means you fix it longer period with backing of our reserves. One thing, if we don't have a resource, we can't back the currency at the fixed level. That will collapse. That's what happened now. If you want to maintain that level for a long period, we need to have, say, in our case, $25 billion of reserves. Then only we can even think about moving into currency board. If we move into currency board now, it will soon, within 1 month, it will collapse. As you are saying, a similar situation, collapse, and we lost our reserves and collapse in March 2022. Within 2-year period, we lost 7 billion reserves and it was collapsed. Same thing will happen if we try to fix, say, moving to currency board now. For that, we need to have a different economic environment.
Dr. Nandalal, you spoke earlier, again a question from one of our viewers. You spoke earlier about policy decisions being the reasons for the downfall of the economic, financial and social situation in the country. Now, if that is the case, why should the citizenry pay the burden for it? Is it the responsibility of those who took the wrong policy decisions to take the brunt of it and be held accountable?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think one can make that argument. Then, if that is the case, it's the responsibility of the government to look into that and find out who are responsible, why that happened, appoint the proper inquiry and commission, and then take actions against people who is to be found, doing something wrong or taking wrong decision. That's
because we saw, Dr. Nandalal, roadmaps being introduced, 6 months roadmaps being introduced, how important is domestic debt. I mean, if you look at the budget also last year, Dr. Nandalal, you must be very aware of this, that everything was to be sourced from locally, putting a burden on domestic banks. So it's very easy to point the finger at individuals, right?
No, you are right. I mean, there was what they call this 6-month roadmap, targeting $10 billion to be raised within next 6 months, and also what they call homegrown solution. All this ideology was there is obviously, it has been proven that it all basically, were not realistic. And then it failed, obviously. That's why we are in this situation.
Dr. Weerasinghe, talking about very ill-fated and short-sighted policy decisions, the decision to peg the rupee against the dollar a few months ago resulted in foreign remittances coming in through official channels drying up and unofficial channels such as Undial and Hawala rising in popularity. But over the past few weeks and months, we saw the central bank taking positive steps. Lanka remit was introduced to abolish cross-border transaction costs and whatnot. How, in the front of foreign remittances, are you witnessing a recovery from all of the steps that you have taken in the recent past?
Yeah, we have seen some improvements recent past. For example, if you look at the interbank exchange rate versus the black market rate, rate outside the banking system. There was a period when we had 203, market rate was 256. There's a 50 rupee
difference.
And then when exchange rate was floated, again the market rate in the within banking system was depreciating fast, and parallelly the black market rate was also having about 50 rupee premium. But we monitor this black market rates now. I think recent past with the measures that we introduced. Recently we have seen the premium is now almost similar to the bank rate. There's no difference between the black market rate and the official rate.
So
now.
In essence, foreign remittances are increasing.
Exactly. Gradually that should increase, and also we see in the interbank market is a lot more liquidity is now available. As a result, we have been able to provide some essential imports, and some importers can finance their part of the needs to the banking system without going through the Hawala system. That actually has worked, but it will take some time to stabilize.
Dr. Nandalal, one of the recent allegations that you made was exporters are not bringing in the required money to the country after exports are being made, and they are parking this money outside. It's very easy to nab these exporters if that case be, because the custom data entries are very clear as to how much of money is being exported and how much of revenue is collected through the bank, so on and so forth, and the central bank has a record on all this. Why isn't steps being taken to nab such exporters? Because that should be probably one of the first steps that should be taken by the central bank as well.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's an important point again. So if we look at the situation we had before this foreign currency situation tightening from last year onwards, in fact, as a result of this resource declining, the currency was not able to sustain at this rate. Central bank brought in the restriction called export proceeds repatriation requirement and surrender requirement, which means exporters who export something from Sri Lanka, the proceeds should be brought back to the country, repatriate 100%. And out of 100%, they are permitted to retain the amount, the percentage that is needed for them to pay for imports. For example, if brought in 100, if they want $60 for imports, they can retain $60, but balance $40 should be converted into rupees, so that liquidity will be available in the interbank foreign exchange market. That's a rule. That was brought in only last year by the central bank with this tightening situation. But what happened, why we could not trace and monitor this? Before that, there was no such requirement for long period. And there was no such requirement, we didn't have a proper monitoring system to trace that money through banks, customs, and as you mentioned, with the exporters. Now, with the system, with the restriction brought in, but still until recently we did not have a proper monitoring system to trace. Now we have a real-time monitoring system that we have introduced, by which we can look at, we can reconcile, so for example, amount of export, the one invoice that is going through customs, we know the value of that, and then we have given them 180 days maximum to bring that process into the country, into the banking system, and then we reconcile now with the transaction volume of exports and value with the banking system, and reconcile how much they have brought in, how much they have converted, how much they have repatriated back for their imports. So that process is now working. But unfortunately, I mean, as you see, still based on the last 2 months data, what we see, for example, on average 1.2 billion worth of exports that exporters have exported from Sri Lanka to some other country, 75% of that export value is reported to be used for import expenditure. That is not very realistic. For example, now if you look at the $100 worth of, say, garment exporter, import content can be 50% maximum. Local value addition is 50%, which means one cannot claim that 100 worth of imports, they are used $76 for their imports. That is kind of a overestimation of import expenditure. So that is what we are trying to now reconcile and asking questions from the exporters.
No, but
and for what purpose that is?
But Dr. Nandalal, I don't
impose
know.
that rule, so that make sure that they bring in what they are supposed to bring, especially in this kind of situation. When country people are suffering from without petroleum, without anything, people who are not bringing even money, not converting, is basically a bad thing to me. That will affect not only the other people's lives, but their own businesses. If we can't find sufficient petrol, diesel, foreign exchange to finance petrol and diesel, even exporters cannot continue their business smoothly. If there are power cuts, if there are shortages of petrol, diesel, they themselves cannot operate smoothly in this country unless they bring proper amount of export proceeds, bring into the country and convert into dollars. What we see, they bring in money. Evidence is that 100% they have brought in. Problem is that out of 100, large percentage still they keep it.
But Dr. Nandalal, in the defense of exporters, exporters have to pay suppliers in US dollars now as well. You're aware of that, right?
Yes.
So
that's why I said 50%. That's why 50% maximum. Because if you look at the say tea exporter, what they export, what is the import expenditure? Maximum is for packaging all these things. You can't say my tea export process I use 50% for imports. That can't happen.
No, let's take for an example, Dr. Nandalal, if an organization like a tea exporting company brings down green tea from China, for an example, and they add value in Sri Lanka and then resend it to another country. So in a situation like that,
percentage. That's a very small percentage of tea exports.
Yeah, but there can be a situation like that.
I mean, that obviously they can show that. If they can show that, okay, this is my import content, then this is permitted.
Right. Dr. Nandalal, how long after the IMF board approval of program will acceptable sovereign ratings to emerge?
In my view, once IMF, approves the program at the executive board, soon after, I would expect the rating upgrades from that point onwards. So basically, this is what, even if you look at the Fitch Ratings recent announcement with the announcement of the star level agreement, the indication that if we are able to get the financial assurances from our creditors, obviously that will be a positive point that could trigger a rating upgrade from that. It won't be from SD to BB or B. It will be to CCC, CC. Gradually, it will be increasing over a period of time. But it should turn around from that point onwards.
Dr. Nandalal, how critical are law reforms, structural adjustments, and effective control measures preventing leakage of state revenue, transfer pricing, money laundering, and control of corruption and illicit financial flows for a successful IMF program? Because this is also one of the pointers that the IMF had brought forward, saying there has to be anti-corruption laws should be strengthened.
Yeah, this is also important reform that this country should have. For example, enforcing legal contracts, and improving the efficiency of the legal reforms. For example, if someone goes to a court for a kind of a contract dispute or something, it takes years to settle. And also the other one, the anti-money laundering CFT regulations, that this is to prevent the money laundering. And the other part is the kind of reforms in the bribery commission. So there are number of the anti-corruption and the governance reforms is one of the key elements in the IMF program this time. In fact, we are not directly involved, but what I see in the program is that there will be experts giving us a technical assistance to these law enforcement agencies, FIU, and also to the bribery commission. All these institutions will have to be made more independent and strengthen their laws, regulation, governance process, so that they can conduct all these inquiries and do it much more independently and much more efficiently within a short period of time. That's the whole idea. For any country to do business and people.
Is the Central Bank of Sri Lanka now independent? Because we've had a lot of allegations, Dr. Nandalal, over the years. This is also when the current president was the Prime Minister, with regard to the central bank bond controversy. In fact, the then governor of the central bank, speaking to me exclusively, said that there is a conflict of interest, and that is how all this transpired with regard to the central bank bond controversy as well. We have seen the manner in which how the former governor of the central bank was also acting based on the whim and fancy of some. It was very evident. There is no question about that. Do you think that the Central Bank of Sri Lanka now is independent?
In my view, central bank, even the current Monetary Law Act, the current legislation that governs central bank activities, there is sufficient independence if one wants to exercise independence given in the law. So what basically prevents or compromises independence of central bank is the governance processes, appointment processes that could politicize the appointment of the members to the monetary board. That's where the central bank independence should be strengthened. That is one of the agreement. And if you look at the budget speech that President made in the Parliament last week, that's clearly that he mentioned that central bank independence is one of the part of the budget proposal that he submitted to the Parliament last week. And also this is part of this IMF program also, central bank independence. And there are several ways. I don't believe it's not only independence. You have a independence as well as accountability. You can't make any public institution independent without making it accountable to the Parliament. So those are the two components should come hand in hand together. One can have independence, but you can't have a full independence without proper accountability to the public, to the Parliament. Any public institution should be accountable to Parliament through the committees. That is why in the new Central Banking Act, in fact, if you look at the previous IMF program that was in 2016 to 17, then the current president was the Prime Minister and Mr. Mangala Samari was the Finance Minister at that time. That is where this new Central Banking Act was drafted and submitted, that Central Banking Bill, even to the Parliament. Bill was actually submitted to the Parliament in 2019 November, then government changed and they basically did not continue that process. Now with the new IMF program and also the budget which was announced by the President last week, there is a proposal to strengthen central bank independence further.
Dr. Nandalal, I know this question begs an answer, not because of anything else, because people want to know who's watching the show tonight. There's always this contention about dual citizens being appointed to the post of governor of the central bank. Dr. Nandalal Weerasinghe, are you a dual citizen?
No, I am not a dual citizen. That I can clearly mention. I am not a dual citizen. I am a Sri Lankan citizen.
You're a Sri Lankan citizen. Dr. Nandalal, getting back into the rating agencies, the way in which how they have downgraded Sri Lankan banks over the last few months is very significant, and it raises an eyebrow to anyone who's looking at the domestic banking sector in Sri Lanka. Do you think the domestic banking sector will collapse in the country if the situation in the country is not arrested?
No, I don't think banks and our commercial bank system will not collapse. That I can tell you with in a confident manner, because I tell you why. So if you look at the domestic banking sector, obviously when the economy is contracting, there will be non-performing loans in the banking portfolio. We are seeing that is gradually now increasing. It will increase further in the next couple of months because high interest rates, economy is contracting, businesses are slowing down, so there will be high NPLs, which means the adequacy of capital. For example, right now, the commercial banks' level of capital under prudential requirements are well above the current levels. But that can deteriorate going forward with the economy contracting, with NPLs rising. This is where we have, from the central bank point of view as a regulator, we are looked at and in discussing with all the banks on individual basis and look at their current levels of capital, what are the risks that could basically materialize with the economic contraction in the next, say, 6 months, and what kind of capital, if they have to, basically recapitalize certain amount, how they are going to plan to infuse new capital if that is a requirement, is all there. And the other one is liquidity. So liquidity, as you mentioned earlier, there is a short-term liquidity issue. And if there is a liquidity shortfall, obviously, rupee liquidity, central bank is staying ready to provide liquidity through our windows, and that is not an issue. It's an issue, in fact, here, more than the liquidity or capital, what I see is a foreign exchange liquidity because of the balance of payment crisis. Not only the banking system, but the whole country is having a foreign currency liquidity shortfalls. Even the businesses, the importers, even exporters, and also the banking system, even people outside the banking system have foreign currency. Banking system also has its share of foreign currency liquidity. That's why we are going to the IMF. Once we get large amount of foreign currency infusion, that situation can be settled. That is where the immediate one, that is why we are going to the IMF, but that's why we are seeking external funding. They have to be filled from external sources so that our foreign currency liquidity situation in the banking system and whole country can be addressed with that program going on. But the domestic liquidity and the bank's situation in terms of capital, that I'm confident that we can manage. There won't be a collapse in the bank, any bank.
So Dr. Weerasinghe, talking about the forex situation in the country, in 2019, before the former government took over, we had around $7 billion in our official foreign reserves. However,
6 billion.
Yes. However, it depleted following what ensued in the country and COVID, whatnot. However, now, since we are facing a forex crisis, how do we shore up these foreign reserves? How do we build up our foreign reserves? Because many experts claim that foreign reserves are only used as a buffer. They are only a last resort. However, the former government, for some reason, they continued to utilize foreign reserves and eventually drew them down. So how would you go about stabilizing and also bolstering our foreign reserves in the long run or even in the medium term, Doctor?
Yeah, this is again, there's a medium to long term strategy that we have presented to the IMF. This first one is because of the foreign currency liquidity shortfalls in the domestic system and in the country. First one is to basically, in short term, we should be able to borrow some money at least to build certain minimum amount of reserve. That is what IMF program is about. That will bring in a small amount of resource into our resource. Then going forward, how we build up resource. That is where the fiscal policy, the fiscal deficit, fiscal consolidation process. Yes. Second one is the monetary policy, the tight monetary policy, and also flexibility, exchange rate, flexible exchange rate regime. Those are the three key elements that would help us to preserve and maintain or build up foreign reserves over a period of time on a gradual basis. For that to happen, we need to maintain a certain flexibility in the exchange rate determination. That's the key one. Second one is to have the appropriate exchange rate policy so that our exports can continue to grow. Countries should be able to earn more foreign exchange on a steady basis for a long period of time, not only through borrowings, but also through earnings. For example, from exports, the remittances, tourism, IT BPO services, and several other ways of our ability and capacity to earn foreign exchange. Without that, we will go back to the same situation. This is a situation. This is why we basically have gone to the IMF 16 times. Still, we were not able to address our issue because we had not been able to earn sufficient foreign exchange for us to be able to meet our import expenditure on a sustainable basis. That's why we always say this is an import dependent economy. So that's not the model. We have to convert this import dependency into export oriented economy. So once you become an export oriented economy, that's what we have seen countries like Malaysia, Thailand, all these countries they turned into after the crisis. Obviously 1997 crisis, India 1991, all these crises, only once they went to IMF, and after they basically transform their economic model into more export orientation so that they sustain that model without borrowing too much. And this is the model we have to basically pursue going forward. And without that, we will again, at some point, short-term borrowings is not a solution. It's a temporary solution. But for us to be able to sustain that, we should be able to earn more foreign exchange in different ways. It's not only export, there are export of services, remittances, a lot of other things, and FDIs is other way, attract foreign investors on a long-term basis. Those are the things that we have to implement.
Dr. Weerasinghe, very quickly, now given the credit rating situation in the country and us announcing a default, we have been locked out of financial markets of borrowing. How long do you think it will take until Sri Lanka can access financial markets once more?
This is a factor of confidence by foreign investors. So if we are able to implement the next 3 to 4 years this program, and if we can overperform the medium-term targets that we have set ourselves for us to achieve. For example, now IMF says our growth may be stabilized around 3%. If we can achieve 5% growth, which is overperformance, instead of building our resource to next year 2 billion, if we can build up to 4 billion, that's an overperformance. If we can bring down the inflation from next year target of 20% to 10%, that's a overperformance. If we can overperform our targets that we have set ourselves, then it will make us have access to international market sooner than what we think right now. Right now, this program says only at the end of this period, program period, for example, in 4 years,
period,
then we should be able to access capital markets again. But until that time, we won't need, because debt restructuring means we expect to get a debt relief.
The moratorium.
Moratorium, something like that.
Right. But I'm still trying to figure out, Dr. Nandalal, the numbers. You say that if we hit the target of $4 billion, the situation is going to be better. It's going to be good. But then again, by 2027, we have to pay $27 billion. That's approximately averaged around $6 billion a year. Right now. So how would the situation be better just because we have $4 billion and we are not paying our creditors?
Yeah, this is the point I was speaking earlier. The 27 billion repayment comes if we did not restructure our debt. That's why we are asking our creditors give us more time to pay 27 billion, not in 4 years, for a longer period of time.
So do you mean to say that we may default again?
Not default. We restructure means we negotiate and get the agreement to pay it over a longer period.
Because we've seen countries like Argentina, Dr. Nandalal, defaulting in the early 90s and then again defaulting again and again and again.
That's a bad situation.
Would that be the casing point when it comes to Sri Lanka as well?
This is why when I say we could overperform, Similarly, we can underperform ourselves. If we underperform, then we may end up again, coming to a close default situation. This is why we have set ourselves the conservative targets,
Right.
and so forth. We will be able to reach that target. Even those conservative targets, if we cannot achieve, that's underperformance, then we might lead to a situation where we end up again in the same situation. That's why we want to ensure we have a program that is achievable, that is sustainable, and also that will give us the confidence, and even for creditors to have the confidence that Sri Lanka will achieve those targets, so that we can make it on a sustainable basis. This is where there's a lot of examples. You're right. Argentina, several other countries have gone several times. They have to restructure debt. That's why we want to do it right in the first time. That's why we want to do it right, do it proper, so that we have no intention to go back to the same situation again.
But there are also instances in the world, Dr. Nandalal, there have been discussions with the IMF, but countries have not gone to the IMF. They found their own solutions, like countries like Belize, for an example. They've done well. Can't we do without the IMF?
We could have done it without the IMF if we started this. At least, it's all about all the reforms. Then, what we are going to do with, I agree with the IMF, is a set of reforms. If we started implementing these reforms, for example, the year ago, then if the reforms are credible, then we probably had $5 billion of resources. So if we implement a serious, credible reform program, even without going to the IMF, we could have gone in the same right path and recovery. Thing is that we don't have a history of credible reforms in the past. Even with the IMF, all the time, when you go with the IMF, we start implementing those reforms. After the end of the IMF program, we go back and reverse all the reforms, and then again come to crisis. And then again we go back to the IMF and again start doing the reforms, and then end of the program we come back to the original situation, reversing all these policies. This is where the problem. So if these are the countries where they have been able to recover out of the crisis without going to the IMF. If they do it in advance, without basically coming into a point of crisis, that was a mistake that we did in Sri Lanka.
I know, Dr. Nandalal, you don't want to mention names of any individual who are responsible, but look at what a pity the country is in at the moment, Dr. Nandalal. Sheer economic mismanagement has led us to this situation, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously, when you see why we are in this situation, obviously some of the bad decisions, bad policies, all these things are led to this situation.
And
there's no question about that. Everyone knows about it.
And then we welcome those people as heroes in the country again, no, Dr. Nandalal?
That I don't know. I can't comment on that.
Dr. Nandalal, now people are in a very precarious situation. They don't know what to do with their money. They have some fear to go and do investments in treasury bills because the situation is not that clear. They were investing a lot in the last few months on 3-month treasury bills on a very short-term basis, not on a long-term basis. For those who are watching the show tonight, what must people do now with the money they have?
I'm sure if you look at from the investment point of view, the government treasury bill is usually sovereign is the least risk in any country. If you look at the sovereign instrument, it's government securities. Now the treasury bills is given almost 30%. Now because of the reason being the government is still borrowing heavily from the market, because government demanding more money from the domestic market because they don't have external borrowings. They are demanding more than what is available. The demand is higher than what is available. In that situation, interest goes up. But going forward, once this external money comes in, the demand should come down. Then interest rates should also come down. So to me, right now, when you look at the interest rates that government is offering, it's a cut at good rates, and it's a sovereign investment. I think when you look at and other bank deposits, some banks are offering 20%, 25%. That's not sovereign, that's say other banks.
No, if you look at, I've always wanted to ask this question, Dr. Nandalal, from you. If you look at the banks, local banks offering around 20 to 25% interest rates on fixed deposits. But if you look at the international banks that are operating, some international banks, I don't want to mention names today on the show, but international banks in Sri Lanka offering interest rates for fixed deposits at the ranges of 4% to 9.75%. What is the reason behind this?
This is the reason that I mentioned earlier. Because they cannot lend in the domestic interbank market.
Yeah, so they don't invest on treasury bills.
They don't invest in treasury bills, so there are, because of the rating, they have restrictions in investing in government securities and investing lending to local banks. They are flush with liquidity. There's nothing for them to do. Because of that reason, they don't want to collect more deposits, and to discourage getting more deposits into their system, they offer rates. Those are very discouraging for investment point of view. What they do basically, they are surplus money. They deposit in the central bank this daily basis deposit window, and earn about say 13-14%, and then they give depositors say 10%, 12%. They make a small margin. And that's what they do. I mean, they don't want to, and also other thing is there's no demand for credit. They can't even lend to the market, even to the interbank, and also the customers' demand is less. So that's why. Because
the prices are the interest rates are exorbitant, Dr. Nandalal. It's not because of anything else.
Yeah, of course. That is the reason why this is the reason for tight monetary policy.
It's approximately around 28%.
Yeah, of course.
The borrowing rate is. Dr. Nandalal, is it advisable to invest in stock market? One of our viewers are posing that question now. In this current economic context.
It's not appropriate for me to, give you a position, investment advice as a government central bank. But you can look at the recent market trends. We are seeing the market is now turning around. What I see, because of the crisis, our real value of our listed companies are relatively very cheap compared to the book value or value of the company. Because of the crisis, it came down sharply, and there's some recovery. But I see, if the economy, if we go to the IMF and get money and economy stabilizes, these prices could even be higher. If you look at the value of the company versus current market price, I think there is a, in my view, I can see a gap. And I can't say when it will go up. That's difficult for anyone to say, but it's relatively cheaper. The current value of our public listed companies, a lot of them, I can't name the companies, but overall, there's a valuation.
What is your growth projections for end of the year?
This year, obviously, economy will contract in real terms by over 8%. The contraction, recession will be minus 8% this year.
Minus 8% this year, despite the fact taxes have been increased?
Yeah, because taxes increased means there's economic growth. Even more taxes mean less consumption and investment. Economy will contract more. That is the reason why negative 8% contraction. But
next year?
Next year, I would say it will recover to basically to not negative, probably somewhere around the small negative or some positive, somewhere in that. It's difficult now to project what will be exactly the next year projection. It all depends on if we can reach and get IMF money earlier, and we can stabilize the economy, say somewhere before December, then next full year will be much better than what we think now. And also several other factors like the tourism sector. If the country we can maintain a kind of a peaceful situation and more stability, then tourism, even this season, tourism industry can recover. So if that recovers faster, then next year growth can be higher.
Dr. Nandalal, when the protests were taking center stage in Sri Lanka, just a few weeks after appointment, you went on to state that if you don't resolve this, I will quit. Are you happy that you didn't quit at that time?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the reason for my statement that at that point, not because of myself as a governor, if there was a continuous kind of a violence and this kind of unrest and political instability continues in a country, whatever the central bank does cannot recover the stabilized economy. So no point of me, the central bank governor, or someone else the central bank governor, is an impossible task. That's why I made it very clear. If the situation continues, the volatility, violence, all this instability, then no point of it. It's only not only the central bank or monetary policy or fiscal policy. It's a social political stability. The peaceful situation, and people should be able to do their normal day-to-day activities even with shortages. Then without that, any economy can't recover. You can see
Governor, that
the war torn like
reminds-
Afghanistan, all these countries, when there's a war, some violence, country can't go.
That brings me to, actually this was mentioned by the IMF during the press conference as well. They were talking about the importance of having a mandate from the people. Realistically, the legislature and the executive, that's parliament and the presidency basically, the legislature and the executive have a distorted mandate. If there is any mandate at all, it has been distorted by, and the popularity not being. Should Sri Lanka be looking at having, because right now the president has 2 years, 2.5 years left of the former president's term. Parliament has until 2025. Should Sri Lanka be looking at having elections in the near future, before 2024, in order to obtain what the IMF is calling a mandate from the people?
I think as far as I understood, it's not necessarily a mandate from an election or from administration. It is basically what they're talking about. Need to have a stable administration which can make the unpopular, difficult decisions to reform the economy. That's what they meant actually. So which means it's not basically talking about having elections or mandate or whether representative or not representative government. It is whatever the government that is in power should be able to implement this program that government has presented to the international community without any disturbances. It doesn't mean, say for example, there's election within next 6 months. Even the new government that comes in through a democratic process should be able to continue implement this program.
But those
are very difficult economic reforms. Those are not easy ones.
So that is where the problem comes in, isn't it, Governor? Because let's assume that, I mean, I don't see them having elections anytime soon. So let's assume that Parliament continues until 2025. We'll be at the tail end of our 3-4 year IMF program. August 2025, new Parliament, new this thing. Moment they come in, they, just like the previous government did, moment they come in, they withdraw from the IMF program. And then we're back in the same mess. So don't you think it's important for government to have legitimacy?
No, not the legitimacy. It's a continuity of correct policies. I mean, this is where I think this government or new government probably would have learned the experiences that what happened with the change of government if you change policies. So this is what basically affects any continuous steady performance of any economy. You need to have a predictable, consistent policies in the same direction, irrespective of what the administration is. This is what IMF is talking about. This is why when IMF team comes here, they have consultation with the government and also they have consultation with the opposition parties also. They consult them and just to have them a feeling of what would they do if they come to power in the next election. They want kind of assurance that whatever the government, these are the right policies, and they would like to see these policies continues, over a long period of time, so that we can have a steady growth. This is why in Sri Lanka historically, several times we have had this, having to go to the IMF several times because we do it in one direction and then after the election, before the election, after the election, we move again backward and then we again go back to the IMF, again we do it and then again move 2 steps backward, then again 1 step forward, 2 steps back. This is the repeating cycles of, balance of payment stresses that we have seen. This is what we want to prevent going forward now. I think now, in my view, there's a great understanding of right policies by all the political parties in this country, especially with the crisis. Not only the representative of the people, even general public, now, in my view, have a better understanding of what are the right things, what are the wrong things. This is why you don't see, unlike in the past, now a lot of people would not protest if they say, government say, we will restructure state-owned enterprises and we will adjust the prices on market-based prices. There's less opposition because people have a better understanding of what are the right policies. If people have a better understanding, people will ask their representatives to pursue those policies. People wouldn't have understanding. If they think wrong policies are right, now they ask their representatives, okay, please cut taxes, please give us a petrol diesel at a subsidized price. Then your representative will have to deliver that because that's what you are asking from your representative. But when people ask me right things, this is why it's important, this kind of programs, to educate overall general public what are the right things to do. And they will demand those things from their representatives and they have the obligation to deliver those things going forward on a consistent basis.
Dr. Nandalal, you all put a blanket cover on imports a few days ago. When will this blanket cover on imports be lifted?
Yeah, it's in fact some of the selected items complete ban on a temporary basis. So if I can explain why this has happened, as I explained earlier, when you look at the numbers, we should have sufficient foreign exchange income to finance our imports. But still we don't see that foreign exchange availability in our banking system. Still we can't find sufficient foreign exchange in the system to finance for essential imports. So then what we see, what has happened basically, some of the foreign exchange that we getting into the country are used in different ways to import certain items. Those are not necessarily essential at this point. For us to be able to finance essential imports, we have to somehow stop some of the imports so that we can use that foreign exchange to finance essential import. That is the whole idea of why we had to restrict certain amount of imports. Obviously, it has very negative impact on certain industries, certain activities. But the question is that what is the priority? What is essential now? Whether if we cannot import sufficient amount of petrol, diesel or electricity, no point of importing anything else. If you import all the other things, without all these basic things, country can't function. Even you import, you can't, importers cannot deliver that from the airport, port to airport to their storage without diesel or petrol. Without electricity, these companies, industries can't perform.
But that means
basic thing is for us to ensure first the essentials. If anything is saved, then we can use balance amount to allow those imports.
In the future,
it's only temporary.
But Dr. Nandalal, in the future, that is the next few months, we'll see a lot of businesses closing down as well, small and medium scale enterprises.
Now, if you see, even before that, say we did not have these restrictions, still a lot of industries, SMEs, could not find sufficient foreign exchange to import their raw materials even without banning these things. They are also effective ban anyway. But some of the people were able to use this informal channel to import certain things, those are not essential. So if you look at a lot of things that they, for example, now we saw period even to conduct examination by the government, government couldn't find the papers to print the examination papers. There are a lot of that kind of essential still, even without banning, those are not available because there is a lack of foreign exchange in the system. This is to ensure more foreign exchange available in the system to finance those essential at this point. Others also may be essential
Right.
at some point, not immediately.
Dr. Nandalal, earlier on when I posed you a question about what is our reserve rate, you said when you took over as the governor of the central bank, there was approximately around 20 million US dollars in liquid cash.
Liquid cash. Yeah.
How much is it now?
It's now, for example, if you look at last week, every week we collect about 30, 40, maximum $50 million on weekly basis. Which means, for example, for a month, we collect about $200 million during a month. But that does not mean we keep that 200 million in our resource. Whenever we collect that amount from resource, then we use that, we sell that to Bank of Ceylon or People's Bank to import fuel, because there's a loan queue for all these things. Which means whatever we collect, we maintain the minimum low level and we try to provide to finance essentially,
So
which means we maintain the lowest level.
So we'll be continuing to pay demurrages in the future as well, in the short term?
It could be, depending on the forex availability, there could be shipment come there, and if you don't have sufficient foreign exchange with the central bank or in the banking system, then they will have to wait until they find sufficient foreign exchange in the system to pay for that, that shipment.
But is there any glimmer of hope for those who are standing in queues now? It was very evident during the last few days. Will we see an end to these queues in Sri Lanka, or will we see an end to these 20 liters of fuel that is being provided weekly to vehicle owners? When will we see an end, Dr. Nandalal?
I think after this QR code was introduced, we are seeing the more efficient use of petroleum products in Sri Lanka. For example, before that, we were on average importing or needed about $450 to $500 million worth of petroleum per month. Now with the QR code thing, it came down to about $250 to $300 million. So it's a question of if we can save $300 million per month, we should be able to provide without any queues. In fact, we saw this about 2-3 weeks. Queues were, very few, and this QR code, the limited availability. What happened now? I think there are two things happening now. One is again with fuel availability with limited supply, then all the government servants are asked to come to work. All the schools have started, and there's a little high demand for fuel. That's the one thing. Second one, and what I saw in the news today, the CPC has introduced a system that this service station, people will have to pay money in advance before they get the fuel quota or their the amount of, say, voucher of petrol or diesel. With that, I think probably that's what I saw in the news. I can't confirm that. That was one of the reasons why fuel is not available, because of the delay in the delivery of even available fuels in the stocks. That is one of the reasons. I think if we address those things, and if we can, right now, $300 million worth of petroleum per month, we should be able to address.
But don't you think, Dr. Nandalal, that on the QR code system, that has to apply to even the ministers? Because the ministers, of course, have backup vehicles and all that. Now, recently, I saw at the airport, there were around 25 vehicles taking one of the top members of the previous government back home. So, mustn't the parliamentarians itself set an example to the people when it comes to fuel consumption?
I don't know whether they also get the same quota. I'm not quite sure about how they get their quota.
Anyway, let's leave it at that. Dr. Nandalal.
That's not for me to, or central bank to comment on.
That's not something the central bank governor can comment. So we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's the final round. We'll ask Dr. Nandalal Weerasinghe as to what measures should be taken by the government of Sri Lanka and the way forward for the country as far as the country's economy is concerned. I got a lot of questions today on the number 0766565353. I tried my best to take up most of the questions that you did pose. I hope I did justice to that. We're going for a short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We are in conversation with the Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Nandalal Weerasinghe.
A brand new year, a year of hope, a year of aspirations and people looking for inspiration.
Our software engineers, our IT expertise are, not seconding to anyone.
A proper investigation led by the CID, this will be swept under the carpet.
Understanding about the stock market, the fundamentals, the economy, that is very important.
Entire ownership of this reclaimed land as well as the governance of Port City are all under the government of Sri Lanka.
No planet, no people, no business.
Yes.
And this is the simple thing about Biznomics.
Your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Biznomics, Saturday and Sunday at 5 p.m.
කතාවයි ක්‍රියාවයි අතර වෙනස අහවර නොවන මෙහෙවර ජාතික මෙහෙවර
මේ තියෙන කෘෂිකර්මාන්තයේ ප්‍රශ්න
පහුණාට කමක් නැහැ ගොවිතැන් කරන්න අපි වන්දි දෙනවා වීවල ඉහළ මිලක් දෙනවා ලෝකෙ නැති කතන්දර හිටපු ඇමතිවරු කිව්වා
ලෝකෙ කිසි රටක කෘෂිකර්මාන්තයේ අඩාල වෙලා නැහැ චීනය ජපානය වගේ රටවල ගොයියට සහන ක්‍රම දීලා ගොයියා ගොවිතැනෙන් ගලවගෙන තියෙනවා
ඔබේ ආගම රට මේක තිබ්බොත් ඔබ ජීවත් වෙයි. අපි
බොහෝ දේවල් ක්‍රියාවට නැංගිය යුතු කාලය ලැබිලා තියෙනවා.
හැම කෙනෙකුටම පුළුවන් ටුවරිසම් වලට දායක වෙන්න. ලංකාව වටේට මුහුද තියෙනවා. ලංකාවේ කිසිම තැනක විදේශිකයෙකුට කන්න සී ෆුඩ් එකක් නැහැ.
වැඩකට ඇති කතාබහක ඉඩකඩ සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 10:00ට TV1 ඔස්සේ.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We are in the final round. I want to pose a few questions to Dr. Nandalal to get some direction on what we are discussing today, what we were discussing today. Dr. Nandalal, were any secrets discussed at the IMF meetings? A lot of people are asking whether there was anything under the table that was discussed, because the IMF team met civil rights activists as well, and they were praised on the current human rights situation in the country. Was anything of this sort brought to your attention or notice?
No, I don't think so. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of things, when you look at the media conference they had and also the statement they made, I think to me, as a person who knows what was discussed as key elements of all the programs and all the documents, I think I don't see anything hidden in what they have already revealed and expressed in public. What basically, obviously, they have not shared, or even government from our side, we have not shared details of measures that we are going to implement in the future. But direction is very clear. For example, now from the government point of view, fiscal policy, it's a clearly revenue-based fiscal consolidation, which means government will have to increase their tax revenues going forward in next 3-4 years, clearly from current 8% of GDP to be able to reach at least 14-15% of GDP by the end of the program, which means government will have to increase taxes in several areas, direct taxes, indirect taxes, wealth tax, several, and administration, all these things. Those are basically already is transparent, and people know what is the direction. That's what is important. And if you look at the government expenditure, again in the short term, what they say, you focus in the short term to protect the poor and vulnerable, allocate more money for social safety net in the short term, and once the economy recovers and inflation comes down, then allocate more money for public investment on a longer period of time on the expenditure, and also rationalize the recurrent expenditure as much as possible through several other reforms for public sector, government public service reforms, and also the state-owned enterprise reforms. And the cost reflective pricing means if the global prices are going up in the diesel, petrol, gas, everything, that there should be a domestic cost reflective pricing mechanism so that these state-owned enterprises will not be losing money, and that will not be a burden to the taxpayers, so that otherwise taxpayers will have a more burden going forward. So those are the clear policies that government, and also not only the pricing, and the other part is short term is the price adjustment. For next year onwards, it's a restructuring of those enterprises so that those can operate in a much more efficient manner, and that will be a less burden to the general public in terms of, for the taxpayers going forward. Those are the clear reforms. There's nothing hidden. In basically, what we don't know, what cannot be revealed is that to what extent prices will be increased in terms of diesel price or gas price, to what extent VAT will be increased or decreased going forward, to what will be that income tax rate or corporate income tax rate which will be coming in the next budget, what will be excise duty, cigarette tax. So that amount cannot be shared now. Even I don't think government has this information. There's nothing called. It is the target that need to collect this amount of revenue as a percentage of GDP next year. That is the target. To reach that target, there has to be certain revenue measures, but it's not quantified to by what extent that tax will have to be increased. That is, even government doesn't know yet. It will be on the basis of the tax revenue estimate going forward. Import duties. What are the imports that will have import duties to collect more duty collections going forward? Likewise, I think there's nothing hidden. Even from the monetary policy point of view, our key objective is to bring down inflation to between 4 to 6 level, perhaps in the next year or following year. So for that, we have to tighten monetary policy now. Once we bring down the inflation, then we can relax monetary policy and bring down the interest rates. Those are the direction. Those are very clear. There's nothing hidden. I mean, if you read these 7 points, I think that covers everything that we have to achieve. There's nothing hidden in this.
Dr. Nandalal, for the people who are watching the show tonight, who are ultimately at the receiving end of all this, whether it's policy directions, whether it's policy decisions, whether it's issues with regard to reforms, what is the message you have for them?
So obviously, when you are going through the economic crisis, and economy will be contracting, people will be losing their employment, the incomes will be lower than what they used to get. The prices they have to face, inflation is higher, real incomes are lower. So this is a painful process. So the best way to cushion this impact is to share the pain across all the sectors of the economy, from top level to bottom, and people who cannot absorb this kind of pain are the lowest income people, poor and vulnerable. That's why it's important. There has to be it is necessary to have a social protection for people who cannot afford to absorb this pain through all these reforms. This is why it's important. People who can afford, or even high income people who still will be affected, but still they can absorb, they should be able to contribute in a bit higher way, so that they'll have to make more higher contribution in terms of taxes, so that bottom of the pyramid can be protected with this painful process. That is a reality in economic crisis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nandalal Weerasinghe, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. I presume this is your first English interview right after the IMF meetings took place locally. So thank you very much, Dr. Nandalal, for joining us this evening exclusively on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Nadeem. Thank you very much, Jamal, as always, for joining us this evening on the show. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. The economy is the start and end of everything. You cannot have successful reforms if you don't have a strong economy. Take care and good night.